cabin air thickened the moment she took her place among the passengers, a presence both quiet and undeniable. Her sharp eyes met the polite smiles that didn't reach the crew's faces, whose cold scrutiny fell solely upon her. The subtle exclusions, the calculated indifference, the invisible lines drawn clearly around her world. This was no ordinary flight. Beneath the surface of routine service, a storm brewed, fueled by unspoken prejudice and cruelty disguised as protocol. But hidden beneath layers of silent endurance was a secret that would shatter the calm and rewrite the story entirely, a revelation that no one aboard saw coming, yet no one could ignore. This tale is more than a moment of injustice. It is a confrontation with uncomfortable truths many would rather hide. If this narrative moves you, hit like, subscribe for more, and tell me where you're watching from and what struck you most in the comments. Your perspective matters and helps keep these stories alive. Mrs. Laverne Whitlow stood near the gate with her shoulders squared despite the ache in her spine, her breath measured and steady. The terminal was crowded, voices echoing in cavernous space, but she held herself apart with quiet dignity. Her cream wool coat was buttoned neatly, pressing against her trim figure, the pale color a deliberate choice that made her silver hair look elegant rather than old. She'd twisted it up tightly, no strands escaping, secured with pins she'd chosen carefully that morning. Her brown leather bag hung at her side, old but cared for, polished so it gleamed even under harsh fluorescent lights. It was the sort of bag that spoke of history, of decades of responsibility and purpose. She was in no hurry, but she understood how to move with purpose. Ahead of her, the boarding line advanced in fits and starts. Clusters of families and business travelers huddled over boarding passes and phones. She watched them without resentment, used to being invisible in these spaces, though it pricked at her some days worse than others. Today was worse. She felt it in her chest, a slow, dull ache that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with memory. Marjorie stood at the gate, uniform crisp, smile gleaming, voice pitched perfectly friendly. She bent to coo at children, complimented young mothers on their bags, winked at older businessmen with a conspiratorial charm. Her laugh was soft and well-practiced, as much a part of her uniform as the little wings pinned to her lapel. Each passenger before Laverne got that smile, that greeting, the careful touch on the arm as their passes were returned. Laverne watched this attentively, shoulders drawing back. She prepared to receive it too. She wasn't naive, but she believed in manners, in the small shared rituals that made life easier to bear. When she stepped forward, offering her boarding pass with steady fingers, Marjorie's face cooled. Her eyes lowered just enough to break contact, the smile flickering out like a snuff candle. She took the boarding pass with 2 fingers, tapping her screen, printing the slip, then set it on the counter, without a word, without looking up, without offering it back. The silence between them wasn't loud. It was surgical, clean, meant to cut. Laverne's chest tightened. She held her tongue, picked up the boarding pass slowly, carefully, so her fingers wouldn't shake. She smoothed it once on the counter, trying to gather herself, then turned. Marjorie was already greeting the next family with that smile again, bright and untroubled. The father beamed back, the mother adjusted her baby's hat, laughter tumbling out easily. Laverne felt her throat close. She walked forward on legs that felt brittle, the boarding pass held between thumb and forefinger like something dirty she needed to dispose of quickly. Her steps were measured, careful, as though she were balancing a glass of water she dared not spill. The jet bridge was cool and smelled metallic, fans blowing stale air against her face. She held her coat tighter, the old bag bumping against her thigh in rhythm with her stride. When she entered the plane, the difference in air pressure made her ears pop. She swallowed against it, blinking quickly. The cabin smelled of cleaner and coffee, expensive but impersonal. Rows of comfortable seats in navy and gray stretched ahead, overhead bins gleaming in uniform lines. Ahead of her, a young white couple was laughing at something one of the attendants had said, their eyes crinkling with real mirth. The attendant chuckled with them, leaned in to lift their bag into the bin with a flourish, nodded them toward their seats with grace. Laverne waited her turn, breathing slowly. She tried to remember the last time someone had done that for her. When the line advanced, she took one step forward and stopped as Marjorie reappeared behind her, face placid. She waited for words, a question, even a direction. Marjorie didn't speak. She only raised one hand and pointed, one sharp motion down the narrow corridor, her face blank. No help, no welcome, just a directive. Laverne's mouth opened, but no sound came. She felt the eyes behind her prickling on the back of her coat. She glanced over her shoulder, saw impatience in the shifting feet, the checking of watches. She pressed her lips shut and nodded once, a jerk of the chin. She began moving, her bag's wheels catching slightly on the threshold. She tugged harder than she meant to, making the handle rattle. The sound was embarrassingly loud in the quiet cabin. She tried to soften her step, but her knees were screaming, the weight of the suitcase making her wrists burn. She told herself she was strong. She'd carried heavier. Children, groceries, hospital records. She'd built a life out of labor, but it felt different now. The effort wasn't invisible to anyone watching, and that was the worst part. At row 17, the aisle narrowed even more. She had to turn sideways to maneuver. Passengers were already seated, earbuds in, faces turned to the windows or to phones, ignoring her struggle. No one moved. She felt her pulse in her temples. She tried to slow down, to not look frantic, but her breath was starting to come fast. At the back, by the lavatories, she found her seat. She stood there for a moment, staring at it. The smell of disinfectant from the bathroom was strong. She set her jaw, lifted the suitcase in both hands, felt the sharp burn in her shoulders. She tried once, twice to lift it to the overhead. The first time it knocked against the edge with a loud thud. The second time it caught and balanced precariously. She felt her wrist pop painfully. She let it go, and it teetered, finally sliding in, barely. She lowered her hands slowly, fingers trembling. She sat, folded her coat in her lap, smoothed the creases. She kept her head bowed. Mrs. Laverne Whitlow sat stiffly in the cramped seat, the constant hum of the engines rattling the back wall behind her, the metallic scent of the nearby lavatory drifting past in unwelcome waves. She folded her coat carefully in her lap, smoothing the fabric with trembling fingers, pressing down every wrinkle, as if she could smooth her own humiliation the same way. She could still feel the sting in her wrists from hoisting the suitcase overhead without help, the sharp pop of her joint reverberating in her memory every time she clenched her fingers. Her eyes lifted occasionally, scanning the rows ahead, watching the small, friendly rituals of service playing out like a performance she hadn't been invited to join. Marjorie moved down the aisle with the slow, choreographed precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times. She smiled at a young man in a suit, leaning in to offer him a hot towel on a silver tray, exchanging a conspiratorial chuckle about the stress of work travel. He dabbed at his face with it appreciatively, praising the service, and she glowed under the compliment. She moved to an older woman in pearls and handed her a fresh towel with a gentle murmur, folding it delicately over her palm like a gift. The woman accepted it with a grateful nod, pressing it to her cheeks, eyes closing in relief at the warmth. But when Marjorie's eyes met Laverne's, there was no softening. She didn't even pause. She held the tray over the service cart for an extra beat, looking past Laverne's shoulder as if she wasn't there, then set the remaining towel down with a small flick of her wrist. It landed with an inelegant flop on the steel surface, damp corners crumpling. Marjorie gave the cart a hard shove forward, the wheels squeaking as they rolled just past Laverne's knee, the towel sliding an inch closer, but still out of reach unless Laverne twisted uncomfortably to grab it. She didn't. She held herself very still, lips pressed into a colorless line, eyes on the back of the seat in front of her. She would not reach for it like a beggar. She would not. Her jaw ached from clenching. She felt her heart in her chest like a dull drumbeat, a reminder she was still here, still enduring this, still being watched by no one at all. Ahead of her, she saw the cart stop again. Marjorie laughed lightly, offering the next passenger a fresh towel from a new pile she had kept discreetly hidden below, making sure each cloth was perfect, unwrinkled, moist, and steaming. The man accepted it with a grin, wiping his hands luxuriously, making a show of enjoying the simple pleasure of being cared for. The contrast burned in Laverne's eyes. She swallowed hard, blinking once, then again, until the stinging faded to a dull blur. The service cart continued its slow procession, rattling minutely every time it passed over the metal floor join. Lucinda had joined Marjorie now, the two of them exchanging small jokes, their faces lighting up for each passenger they deemed worthy. Laverne watched them pour drinks carefully into small glass tumblers, the liquid amber under the cabin lights. She saw them tilt the bottles gently, never splashing, placing napkins down first, so there was no risk of a drip on someone's expensive trousers. To the older white gentleman with silver hair, they offered two options, leaning in close, so he didn't have to strain to hear over the engines. He selected one, and Marjorie nodded approvingly, filling the glass precisely 3/4 full, just as the training manuals required. When they reached Laverne, the cart rattled and stopped with a dull thud at her knee. Marjorie didn't look at her. She adjusted her hair behind her ear, scanned the rest of the cabin lazily, then flicked her eyes downward in Laverne's direction without turning her head. Her chin jerked, one stiff motion toward the cart where plastic cups were stacked haphazardly next to the bottle. The message was clear. Help yourself. She didn't say it, but it was written in every line of her posture, the tilt of her jaw, the absence of any human warmth. Laverne sat frozen for a beat. Her mouth felt dry, her tongue heavy. She could see the condensation on the cold bottle, the way it glistened invitingly under the overhead lights. The plastic cups rattled in their stack when the cart moved slightly, as if mocking her for needing them. Her fingers twitched in her lap. She didn't move. She wouldn't. She refused to reach for it like she was at a soup kitchen, asking for charity. The silence stretched between them. She could feel it, heavy and sticky like oil on water. Finally, Lucinda's voice, falsely sweet, filled the space as she leaned over Marjorie's shoulder to address the next row. She began offering drink options to them, voice lilting with friendly condescension, ignoring the woman frozen in the back row like she was part of the plane's architecture. The cart rolled on, rattling away, leaving Laverne with nothing. She exhaled shakily. Her fingers tightened on the folded coat in her lap, knuckles blanching. She kept her eyes straight ahead, refusing to watch the next passenger receive his drink with a grateful chuckle. She heard it anyway, every sound carried in the tight space, no matter how hard she tried to close her ears to it. Around her, passengers shifted in their seats, some chuckling, some murmuring thanks, their voices fading as the cart rolled onward. No one turned around. No one asked if she was all right. She sat there in silence, the smell of citrus cleaner and stale air thick in her nose. Her mouth stayed dry, the thirst pricking at the back of her throat like a reminder of her place. She swallowed it. She smoothed her coat. She lifted her chin just a fraction, so she wouldn't break. She would not let the tears that burned hotly at the edges of her eyes fall. She would not make a sound. She was used to this. She was practiced. She could endure it as she had endured all things. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her bend. She watched the cart continue its journey up the aisle, the small golden lights from the overhead bins reflecting off the glassware they offered everyone else. She watched the bob of Marjorie's blonde bun as she bent low to speak softly to a young mother, the quiet laugh they shared, the knowing hush of shared womanhood. It was a small, quiet intimacy that made her chest tighten. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on the seat back, the safety card poking out of its pocket like a taunt. The smell of citrus cleaner lingered from the last time the plane had been turned over, mingling with the dry, recycled air that always left her throat raw after a flight. She swallowed once, twice, her tongue heavy and unpleasantly dry. She pressed her back harder into the seat, trying to ground herself, to not think about the cart returning. She heard it before she saw it. The small squeak of the wheels, the subtle clink of the service tray with its damp towels, half-empty cups, and scattered napkins. Marjorie's voice drifted ahead of the cart, smooth and calm, like water over stones. She was explaining the meal options to a pair of businessmen, leaning forward just enough to look engaged without crossing any lines. They chuckled at something she said, and she responded with a laugh so light it sounded rehearsed. Lucinda nodded along behind her, collecting empty cups and arranging them with efficient grace. When they moved to the next row, Lucinda's hands were a blur, her face an attentive mask. She wiped down the tray tables with care, bending at the waist to see better, using fresh cloths folded precisely in her palm. She paused to straighten the safety card for one man whose table she'd wiped, giving him a conspiratorial smile that made him grin back at her like an old friend. She adjusted the armrest for a passenger with a cane, nodding sympathetically when he thanked her. She offered the next passenger an extra napkin without being asked. Laverne watched all of it with a fixed expression, every muscle in her face carefully arranged to hide the way it hurt. She wasn't surprised, not really. But the sting was sharp, fresh, like a paper cut that wouldn't stop bleeding. She thought of the service she used to deliver in her own working days. She'd never allowed herself to give anyone less than her best, no matter who they were. She'd believed it mattered. She had believed people noticed. She tried to swallow down the hot rock of bitterness lodged in her throat, but it sat there, unmovable. The cart drew closer. She could see Marjorie's profile now, the tight line of her jaw, as she listened politely to another passenger, the small nods and practiced empathy. When she turned, that expression vanished. Her eyes flicked down to Laverne's row, assessing it like one might a dirty dish. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She didn't pause. As the cart came even with Laverne's knees, Marjorie's eyes fell to the bag resting under the seat. The old brown leather gleamed from the careful polishing Laverne had done just that morning, determined to keep it presentable, a relic of a time when she had been someone respected. The bag's brass buckle was tarnished but intact, the stitching tight. It was a good bag, a reliable bag. Marjorie's nose wrinkled just a fraction, not even enough for most to notice. But Laverne caught it all the same, that slight, instinctive recoil that said everything words might soften. Marjorie's hand hovered over the handle of the cart, then tightened, pushing it decisively to the side, just enough to keep it well clear of Laverne's seat. The wheels rattled over the joint in the floor, the motion jarring, making the cart jolt against Lucinda's hip. Lucinda adjusted without complaint, resettling the trays. Marjorie didn't look back at Laverne as she did it. She didn't acknowledge the space she was deliberately creating, as if Laverne carried something unclean. Laverne felt the heat crawl up her throat, flush into her cheeks. She didn't shift. She didn't shrink. She forced her back to stay against the seat, even as her fingers spasmed once, twice, against the folded coat in her lap. She kept her eyes straight ahead, refusing to look down at the bag that had suddenly become a source of shame, refusing to see what Marjorie saw when she looked at her. When they stopped in the row ahead, Lucinda's voice went bright, apologetic. She leaned forward, gesturing with her clean cloth, asking permission to wipe down the tray table. The woman in the window seat smiled, nodding graciously. Lucinda wiped it thoroughly, folding the cloth over once to expose a fresh side, carefully scrubbing the edges. She checked it twice, then patted it dry with a napkin, leaving it pristine. She did the same for the aisle seat, pausing to move the man's magazine for him so she wouldn't smudge the cover. Marjorie followed with the service tray, offering refills of water and soda, nodding politely, moving with calm efficiency. She said something that made the window seat woman laugh. Then they turned. The cart rolled forward again, stopping at Laverne's row. Lucinda's eyes darted once to Laverne, then away. She didn't speak. She didn't ask. She didn't wait for permission. She reached for the cloth tucked into the side of the cart, a stained, already damp scrap that looked as if it had wiped half the cabin. She slapped it once against the tray table latch to loosen it, let it drop open with a loud clack, and dragged the cloth over the surface in one perfunctory swipe. She didn't check for crumbs. She didn't fold the cloth. She didn't offer to dry it. She didn't even bother to clean the edges. The table rocked slightly on its hinges, damp streaks catching the overhead light. Lucinda didn't look at it. She turned away. Marjorie didn't pause to offer her a drink, didn't ask if she was comfortable, didn't make a note of the folded coat in Laverne's lap or the way her hands trembled. She pushed the cart with a sharp motion, rolling past without a word, the air displaced from its passing brushing cold against Laverne's wrist. Laverne felt the cloth's wetness seeping slowly into the tray table's plastic seams. She lifted her fingers from her lap once, thought about wiping it with the sleeve of her coat. She hesitated. Her breath rattled in her chest. Then she set her hand back down on the coat, pressing hard, as if she could stop herself from moving at all. Her eyes burned, but she refused to blink. She refused to let the tears that threatened at the edges spill over. She would not give them that. Her knuckles were white from gripping the coat so hard. Her lips had flattened into a thin, pale seam. She felt heat burning in her cheeks, pulsing in her temples. Around her, the cabin moved in a quiet choreography of relaxation, people murmuring softly, flicking through in-flight magazines, pulling blankets over their legs, settling in with familiar entitlement to comfort she had never dared expect. She tried to keep her gaze forward, tried to imagine she was somewhere else, anywhere else. But her eyes betrayed her, flicking to the aisle every time the cart squeaked or the hushed voices of the attendants drifted closer. Marjorie was back, her face still arranged in that polite, polished neutrality that was quickly cracking at the edges. Lucinda trailed behind her, cheeks pink with barely contained laughter from some shared joke that had nothing to do with Laverne, but seemed to orbit her like a mean little moon. They had perfected this routine, and it showed. As they approached Laverne's row, Marjorie's step slowed just slightly, a subtle pause no one else might have noticed. She turned her head just enough to catch Lucinda's eye, her lips curling at one corner in a gesture too small to be called a smile. Lucinda's eyes lit up in response, understanding passing between them like an electric current. They didn't speak aloud. They didn't have to. But the glance was enough, the quick nod in Laverne's direction unmistakable. It was the sort of private exchange that didn't need words to wound. And even though they tried to keep it quiet, they weren't careful enough. Two passengers in the row across the aisle saw it. The older woman there frowned slightly, shifting in her seat as if uncomfortable, eyes darting between the two attendants and the lone older black woman huddled at the back. She said nothing, of course, but she noticed. Marjorie didn't care. She straightened her shoulders, turned back toward the aisle, and reached for the cart handle. She kept her gaze level and distant, eyes flicking past Laverne without ever really seeing her. The cart creaked as she maneuvered it forward, the wheels complaining against the uneven flooring. Lucinda adjusted a tray on top, her fingers tapping out a small, impatient rhythm, eyes sparkling with unspoken amusement. They stopped at the row in front first, their manner transforming like magic. Marjorie's voice softened. She asked about dietary preferences, her tone rich with patient warmth. Lucinda offered options like a sommelier describing wine, her fingers dancing lightly over foil-wrap trays. She even cracked a small joke that made the man in the aisle seat snort with laughter. They took their time there. Then they turned to Laverne. Marjorie didn't ask anything. She didn't offer options. She didn't even glance down to make sure she had the right meal. She simply picked up a tray from a stack, fingers curling possessively around the edge, and held it out over the cart without even pretending to check its contents. She twisted slightly, careful not to bend too close, and extended the tray over Laverne's lap. For a split second, Laverne considered reaching out to steady it, but she hesitated. One fraction of a heartbeat, a tiny pause. She wasn't sure it was meant for her. Marjorie hadn't said her name. She hadn't confirmed anything. That hesitation was all it took. Marjorie let go. The tray thumped onto the narrow table with an ungraceful lurch, its weight shifting unevenly because Marjorie hadn't bothered to center it. The container of sauce on top skidded forward under its cheap foil cover, the seal breaking open. A thin, oily stripe of red-orange liquid slithered over the edge of the container and cascaded in slow, viscous rivulets directly onto Laverne's lap. It soaked instantly into the light gray knit of her dress. The color bloomed there like an ugly, violent flower. For a second, time froze. Laverne stared down at it, at the vivid stain already spreading, too wet to blot without smearing. She could smell it, rich with tomatoes and spices, cloying and humiliating in its domestic familiarity. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Her heart roared in her ears like a hurricane. Marjorie exhaled sharply through her nose. Not quite a sigh of frustration, more like boredom. She didn't apologize. She didn't check the tray. She didn't even glance at the spreading stain. Instead, she turned her shoulder slightly, blocking Lucinda's view of the mess even as her mouth twitched upward in the faintest trace of amusement. Lucinda noticed anyway, her lips pressed together, eyes glinting. She tilted her head, watching with an idle sort of curiosity, like someone observing a street performer. She didn't offer a napkin. She didn't make a move to help. No one else in the row spoke. The older woman across the aisle turned her eyes firmly to the window, her fingers tightening on the armrest, cheeks flushing red with embarrassment that wasn't hers to hold. Laverne forced herself to look down, finally. She watched the sauce settle into the knit weave, staining it irrevocably, a dark, sticky smear that looked obscene against the pale gray. She thought about how carefully she had chosen that dress this morning, how many times she had checked it in the mirror, smoothing it with nervous fingers, wanting to look nice, respectable, worthy of being seen. She felt heat burn behind her eyes. She blinked twice, hard, refusing to let the tears form. She dug her fingernails into the coat in her lap, the only thing still clean, the only thing she could still protect. The cart moved on. Marjorie didn't look back. Lucinda let one corner of her mouth twitch, the ghost of a grin that she flattened as soon as she caught sight of the next passenger waiting, expectant and smiling, unaware of the cruelty that had just passed through like a storm cloud. They stopped, and Marjorie's voice changed again. Soft, kind, patient. She asked about allergies. She recommended a dish she said was her favorite. She made them feel seen. Laverne sat frozen, the sauce cooling on her lap, seeping into her dress and the thin lining underneath. Her fingers trembled, but she forced them still. She breathed carefully, in through her nose, out through her mouth. She reminded herself not to make noise, not to react, not to give them anything they could use. She swallowed the acid taste in her mouth. She focused on the seat back ahead, on the scuffed plastic and the crooked safety card. She refused to look at anyone around her. The hum of the engines seemed to pulse in time with the pounding of her heart. Her eyes stayed locked on the tray table, still slightly askew from where Lucinda had slammed it closed without looking, the surface streaked with dull smears of sauce that no one had bothered to clean. She didn't try to wipe it herself. She sat with her hands in her lap, fingers curled against the ruined fabric, feeling every tremor as it shook through her bones. Outside the window beside her seat, the world was darkness and cloud, nothing visible but the occasional flash of distant lightning on the horizon. She would have welcomed the distraction of a view, but the window was fogged with condensation, a thin blur of cold that felt all too appropriate. Around her, the cabin had settled into a hush, people murmuring quietly to neighbors or tapping on glowing screens. The air was thick with the smell of reheated meals, spilled coffee, the clinical scent of disinfectant and recycled breath. It was stifling. Ahead of her, the service cart sat parked just beyond the next row, angled askew in the narrow aisle. Marjorie and Lucinda hovered over it like conspirators sharing a secret, their heads dipped low, the overhead lights catching in Marjorie's blonde bun and Lucinda's dark hair pulled into a tight knot. Their faces were turned slightly away from the passengers they were supposed to serve, but not so far that their words couldn't drift back to the rows behind them. Laverne could hear them. She wasn't supposed to. That was the point. Marjorie's voice had lost any pretense of professional decorum. It was low and husky with amusement, muffled by her hand, but not enough. She spoke in a rush of words that tumbled over each other, the kind of cruel chatter meant for the back room, but brought out here on purpose, where it could wound. Lucinda answered with a short, high laugh, quickly cut off, as though she remembered too late that they were in public. Then they both went silent for a moment, and the hush was worse than the words, filled with the knowledge that whatever had been said was too ugly even for them to risk it being overheard. Except it wasn't quite silent. They hadn't stopped entirely. Their shoulders shook with suppressed giggles, the kind of childish, mean-spirited laughter that required an audience, that fed on the humiliation of someone who had no choice but to listen. Their eyes cut sideways, darting back toward Laverne's row, checking to see if she had heard them, wanting to catch her reaction. She didn't give them one. She sat as she had been sitting for what felt like an eternity, rigid, upright, her hands folded tight enough that the veins stood out like blue cords on her thin skin. Her face was still, mask-like, mouth pressed into a line so fine it looked carved. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would not look up. She would not shift. But she heard them. She heard every cruel note in their laughter. She heard the deliberate way Lucinda pitched her voice a touch louder, just enough so that the woman in the aisle seat ahead of her flinched and turned, glancing back with uncertainty. That woman's eyes slid over Laverne Stain, her mouth opening as if to say something, then closing just as quickly. She turned back around, cheeks pink, spine straightening in a show of forced ignorance. The cart stayed there too long. It was a blockade in the aisle, an obstruction that forced the other passengers to wait, to crane around it, to sigh impatiently as they tried to get to the lavatory or return to their seats. Marjorie didn't seem to notice or care. Her arm was draped loosely over the handle, body angled in casual defiance of any need to move. Lucinda leaned close, lips moving against her ear as she whispered something that made Marjorie's eyes crinkle in glee. They didn't even bother to look busy. They were enjoying themselves. The murmurs in the cabin grew, discontent spreading in small ripples. A man in a business suit shifted, cleared his throat, pointedly checking his watch. A mother with a sleeping child in her arms frowned as she tried to squeeze past, muttering apologies to the people she bumped. The tension was visible, tangible, and Marjorie finally straightened, rolling her eyes so dramatically that anyone watching would have seen it. Then she pushed the cart forward with one hand, the wheels squealing in protest. She didn't bother apologizing to the passengers, forced to flatten themselves against their armrests to let it pass. She didn't thank them. She just forced her way through, Lucinda following with an affected little sigh, eyes flicking once more to Laverne, this time without even the decency to hide her smirk. The cart cleared the narrow aisle. They stopped again at the front of the cabin, voices dropping back to polite, saccharine tones. They asked about drink refills. They bent low to adjust napkins. They passed out mints. Behind them, silence settled around Laverne like a suffocating blanket. It was broken only when she heard the steady, heavier step of someone approaching from the front. Maddox. The cabin supervisor was taller than both women, with a square jaw and a clipped professionalism that had been worn down to something more perfunctory over years of dealing with difficult passengers. His navy uniform was pressed, but the name badge was slightly tarnished, its corners dulled by fingerprints and time. He walked with authority but not with grace, and the eyes he cast over the cabin were tired, bored, impatient. When he reached the cart, he stopped. Marjorie and Lucinda straightened immediately, their faces smoothing into professional masks. But not quickly enough. He had seen the curl of Marjorie's lip, the snide half-laugh Lucinda hadn't quite swallowed. He didn't ask them to explain. He didn't correct them. Instead, Maddox turned his gaze to Laverne. It wasn't curious. It wasn't apologetic. It was dismissive. He looked once at her ruined dress, the sauce stain drying into a crusty smear, the way she held herself rigid with the effort not to tremble. He registered it. Then he looked away, as if it didn't matter. He folded his arms over his chest. She felt the sting of the tears she refused to shed burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them away, breathing in shallow, careful sips of the stale cabin air so she wouldn't cough or make any sound that would draw their attention again. The plane felt smaller by the minute, the air growing thicker with each breath, voices of other passengers blending into a dull buzz of complaint, boredom, and private amusement. None of it for her. She could hear Lucinda's laugh again, memory replaying it in cruel detail, the way it had hung in the air like poison before fading to a satisfied hush. And Marjorie's face, that smooth mask of professional distance that slipped just long enough to show the small, sharp twist of her mouth, the curl of her nose as she glanced at Laverne's bag, the bored flick of her eyes at the sauce-stained lap. She sat there and felt the weight of it all pressing down on her, squeezing the last of her dignity through clenched teeth and shaking fingers. When the noise in the cabin shifted again, growing more focused and irritated, she realized the cart was returning. She tensed automatically, jaw tightening until her teeth ached. But it wasn't Marjorie or Lucinda in front this time. It was Maddox. His heavy step thudded in the aisle, punctuating the softer shuffles of passengers settling down or preparing for naps. He wore the same expression he'd had before, flat, impersonal, as if this were just another routine he'd performed 100 times. He didn't bother to clear his throat or greet her. He didn't acknowledge the dark stain on her dress or the stiff, silent misery in her posture. He just stopped beside her row and stood there until she turned her head slowly, eyes meeting his out of obligation, not choice. For a moment he didn't say anything at all. The silence was deafening. Around them, nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to watch while stealing glances through lowered lashes or over the tops of their phones. The smell of sauce was sharp in Laverne's nose, cloying and nauseating, grounding her too solidly in the moment. Then Maddox lifted one hand, fingers curling lazily, and pointed. The motion was slow but deliberate, practiced in its dismissiveness. His finger extended toward a cramped seat a few rows back, tucked directly beside the lavatory door where the thin walls vibrated with every flush and the smell of disinfectant was impossible to ignore. He didn't explain. He didn't gesture politely. He didn't even bother to fake concern. He just pointed and waited. Laverne felt the color drain from her face, even as her cheeks burned. Her heart thudded heavily in her chest, an unsteady drumbeat that made her vision tighten at the edges. She held his gaze for a moment that felt endless, something brittle and breaking behind her eyes. But he didn't blink. He didn't soften. He didn't retract the gesture. She knew better than to argue. Slowly, painfully, she shifted in her seat. She had to twist her hips to move, and she winced when the motion pulled at her lower back, the arthritis in her joints flaring to life with punishing precision. She bent, careful not to make sound, and began to gather her things. The coat stayed over her lap, but she had to slide it aside to unbuckle her seatbelt, exposing the full, dark stain to anyone who cared to look. She felt the heat of humiliation crawl back up her throat, almost choking her, but she swallowed it down with practiced misery. When she reached up for her bag in the overhead compartment, her arms shook from the effort. The suitcase felt heavier now, the muscles in her arms protesting the movement with sharp, electric pain. She lifted once, twice, arms trembling, the hard edge of the bag pressing painfully into her palms. Finally, she managed to slide it forward, letting it drop heavily onto the seat she'd just vacated. She steadied herself against the armrest to keep from collapsing with the movement. Maddox didn't move to help. He didn't even watch her directly. He stood there with his arms folded over his chest, weight shifting from one foot to the other in a display of theatrical impatience. His eyes roamed over the cabin, settling on anything except her, as if she were invisible, as if she weren't worth the energy to see. She heard a small, stifled giggle behind her. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. Marjorie and Lucinda stood a few rows back, watching openly now, arms folded across their chests in perfect mirror image of their supervisor. Their faces were split with satisfied little smirks, lips twitching with unspoken commentary. They didn't even bother to whisper anymore. They had no need to hide it. The message was clear enough without words. They had won. She was moving because they had made her. She was standing, struggling, humiliated because they wanted to see her do it. They watched every moment as she straightened up, suitcase handle clutched so tightly in one shaking hand that her knuckles went bloodless. She turned carefully in the narrow aisle, the coat folded over her arm to try to hide the worst of the stain, even though it was already too late. Her eyes stayed low, fixed on the thin, scuffed carpet that led to her new seat. It was smaller than the one she'd left, closer to the bathroom. The air there smelled harsher, more metallic, with every flush punctuating the silence with a wet, rattling growl. She maneuvered herself into the new seat with excruciating slowness, mindful of her joints, mindful of the eyes she felt pressing into her back like knives. She tucked her coat onto her lap again, but she couldn't hide the stain that spread across her dress, dark and unignorable, a permanent reminder of everything she'd just endured. Maddox turned without a word and walked back down the aisle. Marjorie and Lucinda lingered a moment longer, watching, sharing one last conspiratorial glance, their satisfaction evident in the lines of their faces. Then they turned as well, moving on to the next row, to the next task, as though nothing had happened at all. Laverne sat perfectly still, her breathing shallow, her heart pounding a hollow, hopeless rhythm in her chest. She kept her eyes down, refusing to meet the gaze of anyone around her, refusing to let them see the wet shine that threatened her eyes. Her new seat near the lavatory felt claustrophobic, the scent of antiseptic stronger here, mingling with the stale air recycled endlessly through the cabin. She had folded her coat neatly, trying to mask the large, dark stain that marked her dress like a badge of humiliation. The weight of exhaustion pressed on her limbs, but her resolve remained intact. She was used to enduring discomfort, to carrying burdens both visible and invisible, and today was no different. As she shifted her feet to position herself beside the cramped seat, a sudden movement caused her wallet, worn smooth with age and care, to slip from her grasp and fall to the floor with a soft thud. Time seemed to slow as it tumbled, landing open on the carpeted aisle, the crease revealing a faded but unmistakable emblem, a golden employee badge edged with worn trim, engraved with the name Laverne Whitlow and the proud title, Director of Customer Experience for Skylure Airlines. The badge looked like a relic from another lifetime, a symbol of authority and respect, now exposed in the harsh fluorescent light of a cramped airplane cabin. Lucinda, who had been just a step behind her, froze. Her eyes widened in shock, the gleam of surprise flashing across her face before she swiftly knelt to retrieve the wallet. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked it up, fingers brushing the worn leather and the embossed badge with unexpected reverence. For a moment, she held it too long, eyes scanning the inscription, the name that was meant to command respect yet had been treated with such blatant disregard mere minutes ago. She straightened abruptly, lips pressed tight as if to hold back a gasp or an involuntary curse. The badge was carefully placed on the top of the service cart, nestled among the trays and napkins, almost reverently, yet with an unspoken warning hanging in the air. Lucinda's gaze flicked toward Marjorie, and the two exchanged a silent, loaded glance that spoke volumes more than words could convey. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted imperceptibly but irrevocably. Passengers nearby began to murmur softly, their heads turning, curiosity piqued by the subtle tension that rippled through the flight attendants. A man with silver hair in the adjacent row leaned forward slightly, his eyes catching the glint of the badge as it caught the light. He regarded Laverne with a slow, measured appraisal, his face tightening with understanding and concern. The tightness of his jaw and the slight furrow in his brow told a story of recognition. He knew who she was. Maddox, the cabin supervisor, passed by with an exhausted air, but stopped abruptly as he noticed the badge on the cart. His eyes locked onto it, pupils dilating as memories surged forward unbidden. Memories of meetings, award ceremonies, strategic planning sessions, where Laverne's face had been immortalized on plaques and newsletters. Sweat beaded on his forehead as realization dawned, and he swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of the weight of his earlier dismissiveness. The casual cruelty and indifferent neglect he had shown now felt like a stone sinking in his stomach. He glanced quickly toward Laverne's seat, noticing the way she sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, but her posture radiating quiet strength despite the humiliation she had endured. No one had dared approach her since the incident with the sauce, and she seemed almost untouchable now, cloaked in a dignity that belied the tears threatening just behind her eyes. Whispers rippled through the cabin as more passengers noticed the tension, the sudden gravity that had replaced the casual routine of service. Phones were raised discreetly to capture the scene, the exposed badge, the stiff posture of the woman it belonged to, the uneasy faces of the flight crew. It was as if an invisible line had been crossed, and the ordinary rules no longer applied. Marjorie and Lucinda's smiles faded, replaced by tight, nervous expressions as they sensed the shift in power and perception. They exchanged uncertain glances, the easy confidence draining away like water through clenched fingers. Maddox cleared his throat, the sound rough and unsteady, and took a slow step toward the front of the cabin, avoiding direct eye contact with Laverne as if embarrassed by the confrontation his presence implied. The cabin's atmosphere was charged with anticipation and unease, a collective breath held as passengers awaited what might come next. Laverne herself remained calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed ahead with a quiet determination that seemed to fill the small space around her. Despite the weight of the stain on her dress and the invisible scars of neglect and cruelty, she carried herself with the grace and strength of someone who had faced adversity before and survived. His eyes, sharp and discerning, caught the flicker of gold resting on the edge of the service cart, a glint that momentarily pulled his attention from the newspaper folded carefully in his lap. He shifted slightly in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him, as his gaze settled on the badge, a badge embossed with the name Laverne Whitlow and her title as Director of Customer Experience for Skylure Airlines. Recognition dawned slowly, his features tightening as he processed the implications. He leaned subtly away from the two flight attendants standing near the cart, their previous smug demeanor now giving way to a noticeable unease under his silent judgment. His narrowed eyes swept the cabin discreetly, taking in the muted expressions of other passengers who, like him, sensed the sudden shift in the room's energy. The weight of unspoken acknowledgement pressed down on the attendants, who now seemed markedly less assured, their movements less fluid, smiles forced. Maddox, the cabin supervisor, was nearby, his uniform crisp, but his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. His gaze caught the metallic glint of the badge from across the aisle. His breath hitched slightly, the tension visible in the stiff set of his shoulders and the slight furrowing of his brow. Beads of sweat formed at his hairline, the heat of the cabin mingling with the cold realization that the woman he had so casually dismissed was someone of significant stature within the very company he served. The image of Laverne Whitlow's proud portrait hanging in the airline's halls, adorned with accolades and glowing testimonials, flashed vividly through Maddox's mind. It was a reminder of the standards she had set, the policies she had championed, and the dignity she had demanded. Standards now violated in the cramped quarters of the plane. His eyes darted towards Laverne, who sat quietly in her seat, her hands folded delicately in her lap, face composed yet radiating a quiet strength that made it impossible to overlook her presence. The stain on her dress was undeniable, but it did nothing to diminish the aura of authority she still carried. Around them, a subtle murmur grew among the passengers. Phones were discreetly raised, cameras clicking softly, capturing the unexpected scene unfolding in mid-flight. Whispers passed like ripples through the rows, curiosity and sympathy mingling with outrage and disbelief. The two attendants, Marjorie and Lucinda, now wore expressions marked by unease and self-consciousness, the earlier confidence and disdain replaced by tight lips and darting glances. They exchanged nervous looks, the gravity of the moment settling over them like a shroud. Maddox cleared his throat, a slight quiver betraying his nervousness as he turned toward the flight deck, his footsteps brisk but hesitant. The captain's door closed behind him, leaving the cabin filled with a thick, expectant silence. Laverne's eyes remained fixed on the seat back in front of her, unblinking and resolute. Despite the humiliations she had endured, the cold dismissals, the careless neglect, the public embarrassment, she sat with the calm dignity of someone who knew the value of endurance. Her breath came slow and steady, a silent defiance that spoke louder than words ever could. Maddox's gaze never left her. His usual composure cracked visibly as he reached into his pocket for his radio, fingers trembling with an uncharacteristic hesitation. He raised the device to his mouth but paused, taking a sharp breath that rattled in his chest before speaking. His eyes remained fixed on Laverne, the weight of recognition heavy and undeniable now. The tension radiating from him was a stark contrast to the cold detachment he'd shown earlier. Nearby, Marjorie and Lucinda stood close to the service cart, their previous arrogance dissolved into stark panic. Their smiles were gone, replaced by tight lips and wide, darting eyes that flickered nervously between Maddox, the cockpit door, and Laverne. Their hands gripped the cart handle so tightly that knuckles whitened, and subtle tremors betrayed their inner turmoil. Lucinda shifted from foot to foot, biting her lower lip as if trying to hold back a sob, while Marjorie's eyes darted furtively to the other passengers who had begun to notice the sudden shift in energy. The weight of what had been revealed and the consequences it promised seemed to close in around them like a tightening noose. Across the cabin, a hush fell over the passengers, many lowering their phones as if realizing the gravity of the moment. Eyes that had once flicked in amused judgment now held sympathy, respect, or quiet shock. The man with the silver hair, who had earlier recognized Laverne's badge, leaned back in his seat, arms crossed with a solemn expression that spoke volumes. The flight attendant's earlier cruelty now hung in the air like a stench they could no longer disguise or ignore. Maddox lowered his radio with a shaky exhale, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. The realization that they had allowed this woman, this former director of customer experience, a symbol of the airline's integrity, to be humiliated in their care unsettled him deeply. He straightened slowly, trying to compose himself, but the stress was etched in every line of his face. Marjorie swallowed hard, glancing down at the service cart, then back to Laverne, her confidence shattered. Lucinda's fingers trembled as she wiped a bead of sweat from her temple, her breaths shallow and uneven. The cabin crew, once a picture of polished professionalism, now looked disheveled and vulnerable, their facades cracked by the undeniable truth of their failure. The intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice, calm but firm, filled the cabin with a formal announcement apologizing for any discomfort caused during the flight and assuring passengers that the airline was committed to upholding the highest standards of service and respect. The words seemed both necessary and inadequate, underscoring the severity of the situation without naming it directly. Laverne's gaze did not waver. She sat with quiet dignity, the stain on her dress a stark contrast to the poise in her expression. Her presence demanded acknowledgement, and though she said nothing, her silent strength spoke louder than any apology could. As the plane began its final descent, the cabin held a collective breath, the atmosphere thick with anticipation and unspoken reckoning. For Marjorie and Lucinda, the once bright smiles were gone, replaced by shadows of regret and fear. For Maddox, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders as he prepared to face the consequences of his earlier indifference. For Laverne, the moment marked not just the end of a flight, but the beginning of a long-awaited restoration of respect and justice. Mrs. Laverne Whitlow stepped off the jet bridge into the bright sunlight, the warmth contrasting sharply with the cold, recycled air she had endured on board. Each step she took was steady and purposeful, the weight of the stained dress and bruised spirit left behind in the cabin now replaced by a quiet resolve that seemed to radiate from within her. Around her, the muted murmurs of the passengers still aboard the plane lingered like echoes, but here on the tarmac, a different kind of silence prevailed, a silence heavy with acknowledgement and the promise of change. Airline representatives awaited her with bowed heads and formal expressions of apology, their presence a symbol of the institution's recognition that what had transpired was unacceptable. Yet the true significance of this moment was not found in their words or gestures, but in the steadfast dignity with which Laverne bore herself. Her eyes scanned the crowd of onlookers, meeting the gaze of strangers, allies, and those who had stood silently in witness to the unfolding injustice. There was no triumphalism in her expression, no need for vengeance or bitterness. Instead, there was a calm assurance born of years of resilience, of knowing that the fight for justice often traveled a slow and winding road, but that it was never in vain. Behind her, Maddox, Marjorie, and Lucinda were led away, their faces a pale mask of regret and the heavy burden of accountability. Their silence spoke volumes, a tacit admission that their actions, born of prejudice and arrogance, had consequences that reached far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. As Laverne moved away from the aircraft, the voices of the passengers and crew began to swell into a chorus of whispered conversations and the clicks of cameras, capturing a story that would not be forgotten. Her journey had become a beacon, a testament to the power of dignity in the face of cruelty and the necessity of standing firm against injustice. She paused at the edge of the tarmac, taking a deep breath of the fresh air, the sun warming her face as she looked toward the horizon. In that moment, she embodied more than just the wrongs endured or the victory achieved. She symbolized a call to all who witnessed her story to refuse complacency, to challenge discrimination wherever it lurked, and to speak out against the quiet violences that so often go unseen. Her legacy was not merely that of one woman's endurance, but a rallying cry for justice, equality, and respect, values that must be defended not only in grand gestures, but in the everyday acts of recognition and kindness. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind her, Laverne Whitlow's silhouette stood tall and unbowed, a living testament that while silence may persist for a time, truth and dignity will always find their voice. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and subscribe for more powerful narratives that shine a light on important issues. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot? Did any parts stand out to you? Also, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your feedback means a lot and helps shape future stories.